The renovation team was only supposed to tear down the old West Wing lockers. A quick job. 3 days, maybe 4. That part of Red Pines High School had been closed off since 2009 after a water pipe burst and flooded the hallway. Since then, the lockers, dusty, dented, long forgotten, stood untouched like metal tombstones. No one had used them in over a decade. The janitors didn't even bother sweeping that part of the school anymore. But on the 14th of October, 2020, around 2:17 p.m., everything changed. A maintenance worker named Greg was unbolting the hinges off locker number 128 when something jammed behind the door. It wasn't rust or bent metal. It was resistance, like something was pressing against it from inside. He gave it a yank. The door finally popped open with a screeching metallic groan. Inside wasn't empty space. It was lined in dust, thick as ash. A crumpled piece of plastic poked through the sediment. Greg reached in and pulled it out, brushing the grime away slowly. It was a school ID. The corners were worn. The laminate peeled. But the name printed just above the barcode was unmistakable. Eli Turner. Class of 2010. Greg stared at the card for a long time like it was staring back at him. He didn't speak. He didn't call out. He walked straight to the main office, handed it over to the secretary, and simply said, "You're going to want to call the police." By the time Detective Carla Keene arrived on scene at 4:06 p.m., the entire west hallway was sealed in yellow tape. Keene wasn't new to cases involving schools, but something about the way the vice principal met her at the front door gave her pause. He didn't offer coffee. He didn't apologize for the call. He just said 5 words. "Do you remember Ellie Turner?" She did. Vaguely. The name had floated in the background of the department years ago. A boy who'd vanished in 2007. No signs of foul play, no note left behind. The prevailing theory was that Eli had run away. A few classmates mentioned he'd talked about hitchhiking to Oregon. He'd missed some homework. He was quiet, withdrawn. Just another kid who disappeared, the file buried under newer, flashier crimes. But now, 13 years later, his student ID had been found inside a sealed locker in the same school he was last seen walking through. Keene ducked under the tape and walked toward locker number 128. The door hung open like a jaw that had finally broken loose. Inside was still layered with thick dust, as if time had solidified. A maintenance flashlight had been placed on the ground to illuminate the interior. On the upper shelf, alongside the ID, sat a pen cap, a single shoelace, and a button conclusively identifiable. But there was no mistaking the ID. She took a photo of it before it was bagged as evidence. "Locker been opened since 2007? She asked. "No, ma'am," the facilities director replied. "Whole wing's been shut since that leak. No one had keys to these except the old janitor. He retired in 2012. We had to saw through the latch." Keene crouched down, eyes tracing the locker's base. There was something about the rust, pattern uneven, like moisture had pooled at the bottom, but it hadn't rained inside the school. She stood. "Get me blueprints of this wing," she said. "Why?" "Because if that locker sat untouched for 13 years, and this card was inside the whole time," she paused, "then Eli Turner didn't run away. He never left this school." That night, Keene went home and dug up the original missing persons file. The details came flooding back. May 17, 2007, Eli Turner, age 15, failed to return home after school. Last seen by his science teacher leaving 5th period, heading toward the locker hallway. No signs of struggle. No known enemies. Family life stable but emotionally distant. Police initially suspected runaway due to vague statements made to classmates. No credit card activity. No online presence since. A footnote near the bottom chilled her. Note: parents reported son said he didn't feel safe at school but gave no further details. That line had been glossed over at the time, labeled emotional exaggeration. Now, it loomed. Keene drove back to Red Pines just past midnight. She couldn't sleep, not with that locker burned into her mind. The west hallway smelled like mildew and cold air. A school at night quiet, but heavy, like it was holding its breath. She stood in front of locker number 128 again, just her and the dim glow of her flashlight. Why would his ID be left here? If Eli had truly run away, he wouldn't have tucked his badge inside a locker no one used. Was it planted, hidden, or had he come here in those final moments? Her phone buzzed. Forensics confirmed partial prints on the ID non-matched anyone in the system, not even Eli. But dust embedded on the plastic was consistent with long-term placement. The ID hadn't been placed there recently. It had been there for years. Keene felt something tighten in her chest. She turned toward the row of lockers across from number 128, took a deep breath, counted 5 steps down. There on the floor something metallic caught her light. She crouched. It was a paperclip, twisted into a crude hook. She bagged it on instinct, even as doubt tugged at her. It might have meant nothing, but something else did. Etched into the paint on the bottom corner of locker number 130, in letters barely visible unless the light hit just right, were 4 carved words. "Look under the dust." Keene's breath caught. She swept her light again across locker number 128. Inside, under the shelf, the bottom panel looked uneven, as if something had been jammed or warped. She slipped on gloves, reached inside, and felt along the base. Her fingers brushed metal, then a raised edge. A false floor. Heart pounding, she slowly pried it upward. It lifted with a groan, revealing a shallow compartment beneath, no larger than a textbook. Inside, a folded piece of lined notebook paper, yellowed, crumbling at the creases. She opened it carefully. Written in faint pencil, shaky and rushed, "If you find this, I didn't run. Please don't forget me. E.T." Keene stood there in silence. She could hear the hum of old lights, the distant creak of the school settling. This wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. This was a buried cry for help. And someone, maybe more than one person, had tried to make sure it was never heard. She walked out of that hallway knowing exactly what she had to do. The case of Eli Turner was open again. And this time, she wasn't going to stop until someone answered for what happened inside this school. Detective Carla Keene returned to her office just after sunrise, the folded note from locker number 128 sealed in an evidence envelope on her passenger seat. She didn't speak to anyone, didn't need coffee. The discovery in the locker had tilted the entire case off its old axis. Eli Turner hadn't run away. He had been here. He had cried out in silence. And someone made sure no one heard him. At her desk, she reopened the original file. The photos of Eli were grainy, taken from a school ID and a blurred hallway camera. Brown hair, slightly messy, eyes soft but distant. He looked like every other high school sophomore who just wanted to make it through the day. She dug deeper student records, faculty reports, anything that hadn't been cross-checked. She pulled the 2007 yearbook from the archives and flipped it open. There he was, 3rd row, 4th from the left. Eli Turner, smile faint, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the photographer had caught him mid-exhale. She started marking names, who sat near him in classes, who had lockers nearby, who might have seen him last. The list wasn't long. Red Pines wasn't a big school. And in 2007, the student body was just under 300. Among those names, Ben Morris. Ben had been a sophomore too, same grade. In fact, Keene's files showed they'd both been in the astronomy club, something Eli was known to obsess over. She circled his name. Within the hour, she was knocking on a door on Maple Street. A man in his early 30s opened it. He was pale, hair uncombed, eyes cautious. She introduced herself, showed her badge, and mentioned Eli. Ben flinched like she'd said a ghost's name. He's the one they found the ID for, right?" he asked, voice already trembling. Keene nodded. "I thought he ran," Ben said quickly. "Everyone did." "But you were in the same club," Keene replied. "You had lockers in the same wing." "Crease." Ben hesitated. Keene waited. The silence did the work for her. He said, voice cracking. "I saw him that day." Her pen froze. Ben looked down. "May 17th. I was going to get my jacket from the science lab and I saw him. Eli. He was at the end of the hallway, near the lockers, and he was arguing with someone." "Who?" "I don't know. I couldn't see." just heard voices, but I remember what Eli said. He yelled, "Stop it, I don't want to do this anymore." Then the other guy pushed him. Not hard, but enough that he stumbled. Keene leaned in. "Why didn't you come forward?" I was scared. And I thought maybe it wasn't serious. And after Eli disappeared, everyone said he ran. I didn't want to be blamed for anything. Did you recognize the voice? Ben hesitated again. It might have been Jake Weller. Keene's pulse quickened. Jake had been a senior then. Football captain. Now, over a decade later, he was back at the school part-time as a summer athletics coordinator. Ben added, "He was the kind of guy people didn't mess with. Teachers loved him. But Eli, he always avoided him. They had some weird tension. That was the first solid link. A name, a confrontation." Keene left Ben's place and drove straight to the school. Jake Weller was in the gym, supervising preseason training drills for incoming freshmen. He looked older, thicker, the kind of man who aged into his broad shoulders. He greeted her with a smile that was too polished. "Detective Keene, what brings you here?" She cut straight to it. "Eli Turner!" The smile faltered. Just slightly. "I heard about the ID," he said. "Crazy, huh? Everyone figured he ran off. Did you know him well?" "Not really. Just another quiet kid. Bit strange, if I'm being honest." "You ever have any problems with him?" Jake chuckled, forced. "No, ma'am. I was a senior. He was a sophomore. Whole different world." Keene didn't push harder. Not yet. Instead, she requested access to the old locker hallway. He said he didn't have keys. Of course he didn't. Back in the station, Keene pulled old staff interviews from 2007. Teachers, janitors, counselors. One name caught her attention. Mrs. Langley, the science teacher. Her notes from that time were full of red flags. Eli seemed afraid of certain students. Wouldn't name names. And left class early the day he vanished. Was working on a final astronomy project never submitted. Keene tracked her down. Now retired, Langley agreed to meet at a local diner. She was in her 60s now, but her memory was sharp. "I always thought they didn't look hard enough," Langley said, stirring her coffee. Eli wasn't the kind of kid who'd just run off. He loved school, loved learning. He'd stay after class just to finish lab notes. Keene showed her the note from the locker. Langley pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh, God," she whispered. "He wrote that. That's his handwriting. I'd know it anywhere." "Did he ever mention being bullied?" Langley nodded. "Not directly, but he flinched whenever certain boys passed by. He once asked if there were cameras in the locker wing. When I asked why, he just said, 'Because that's where the scary part is.'" Keene thanked her and left with a growing sense of dread. Back at the school, she requested blueprints of the West Wing. The custodian, now in his 70s, brought her a dusty folder from storage. Inside were diagrams from 1985. And that's when she saw it. Locker row number 120 through number 130 had been installed over what used to be a narrow maintenance crawl space. The implication chilled her. If the crawl space hadn't been sealed, if someone had known about it, if Eli had been pushed cornered locked inside, Keene returned to locker number 128 with a team. This time, they brought thermal scanners. Behind the metal frame and drywall, something was there. A cavity. Hollow. Roughly the size of a person curled into a fetal position. Keene's throat tightened. Her hands trembled as she gave the order. "Open the wall." The sledgehammer struck drywall with a muffled crunch. Again. And again, until the layers began to cave in at just plaster, but insulation, wood, and something else, something older. The outline of a narrow cavity emerged from behind the row of lockers, a forgotten pocket of space wedged between structural beams. Detective Keene stood silently just feet away, her eyes fixed on the shadowed void behind locker number 128. The forensics team moved methodically. They cleared debris, vacuumed dust, documented everything. Then the flashlight beams found it. A fragment of fabric, tattered, faded blue, stitched along the edge. A strip of elastically the waistband of old-school uniform pants. And just beneath it, Bone. No one said a word for several long seconds. Then the lead tech leaned back and whispered, "Remains. Human. Juvenile male." Keene exhaled slowly. Her hand found her badge and pressed it to her chest, not out of habit, but something like reverence. For 13 years, Eli Turner had been missing. For 13 years, his name sat in cold files and fading memory. And now, he was here. Not across state lines. Not in Oregon or Utah or living under a new name. He'd been in this school the entire time. The crawl space was less than 4 feet wide. Its air was stale and heavy, the smell of mold and dust soaked into every beam. But in that dark corner, they found more than just bones. They found his backpack. The one his mother remembered so clearly, the NASA patches still clinging to the fabric, though stained and curling. The main pocket held crumpled papers, a pencil pouch with cracked plastic, and a copy of Night Sky Atlas with corners bent and spine cracked. But the real story lay folded between the pages. A note, written in the same rushed, desperate hand as the one from the false locker floor, a second voice from a sealed past. "It's been a day, I think. Maybe 2. It's dark. No one hears me. I yelled at first, but I don't anymore. I don't want him to come back. Underneath, just 3 words, each written with heavy pressure until the pencil tore through the paper. Jake locked it. Keene closed her eyes. The weight of it hit all at Onsano, just the horror of the death. But the silence that followed, the teachers who didn't ask, the classmates who assumed, the system that never dug deeper. She stayed at the site for hours, overseeing the recovery like it was a funeral. The next morning, the department held a press briefing. Keene stood behind the podium with the ID in one hand and the second note sealed in plastic in the other. Reporters buzzed, microphones extended like antennae toward her mouth. "We are reopening the 2007 missing persons case of Eli Turner," she said clearly. "Yesterday, human remains were discovered in a sealed space behind locker 128 at Red Pines High School. Early forensic analysis indicates the victim is consistent with the age, sex, and personal belongings of Eli Turner. We have reason to believe his death was not an accident." Flashbulbs popped. A gasp broke the air. Then the questions came like hail. Is this a murder investigation now? Was anyone questioned back in 2007? Why did it take 13 years? Keene didn't flinch. "We are treating the case as a homicide, pending final autopsy confirmation. Anyone who attended or worked at Red Pines High School in 200, the 7th of, may be contacted. We ask for cooperation." Eli Turner was 15 years old, and he never ran away. When the cameras cut, Keene went straight to the interrogation room. Jake Weller was already there. He'd come voluntarily, his lawyer at his side. He wore the same smug confidence she remembered from the gym, the polished smile, the relaxed posture. But today there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Nerves. Keene laid out the evidence on the table. The ID. The second note, the photo of the cavity in the wall. Jake leaned forward. "So what? I didn't put him there." "You were seen arguing with him the day he disappeared." He shrugged. "I argued with a lot of people. You were one of the last known people to have contact with him." "That doesn't mean anything. People vanish. He was weird, quiet. Maybe he climbed in himself." Keene stared at him. "Jake, there was no way out from the inside. The panel locked from the exterior." Jake glanced at his lawyer, who gave the smallest shake of the head. Keene didn't move. She pulled out one last photo, a page from Eli's notebook. The words written in dark, panicked loops. Jake locked it. Jake's face twitched. "Kids write stuff," he said too quickly. "They make things up." Keene leaned closer. "He didn't make up being buried alive, did he?" For the first time, Jake didn't answer. Back at her desk, Keene started to reconstruct the timeline. May 17, 2007, Eli leaves science class. Witnessed near the locker wing, seen in a confrontation, never seen again. The theory took shape like fog resolving into mountain. Jake Older stronger cornered him. Whether it was hazing, a prank, or something darker, he forced Eli into the crawl space, locked the panel, left him there. Maybe he thought it was temporary. Maybe he didn't care. Either way, he never came back. No one noticed Eli was missing until after 5 p.m. By then, most of the school had emptied. Security was lax. No cameras in that hallway. And once the old pipe burst in 2009, the entire area had been sealed and forgotten. Except it hadn't been forgotten by everyone. Keene requested access to old janitorial logs. That's where she found it. A maintenance ticket from 2008, 1 year after Eli vanished, reported a smell near locker number 128, filed by a substitute custodian. Handwritten note. Faint odor. No visible issue. Assigned to J.W. Tay. Jake Weller had worked part-time as a summer facilities assistant before college. He'd been assigned that section. Keene called the custodian who'd originally filed the report. Now retired and living in St. Louis, he remembered Jake vaguely. Big kid, always on his phone, didn't like being alone in that hallway, told me once it gave him the creeps. The walls were closing in. Meanwhile, word had spread. Eli's name was on every headline, every local broadcast. Remains found in school locker wing. Boy who disappeared may have died on campus. Justice after 13 years? Rachel Turner, Eli's older sister, had returned to town. She hadn't been back to Cameron, Missouri since 2010. Now a school counselor herself, she sat down with Keene late one night at the station. He hated that locker hallway, she said softly. Said it felt like a place you go to disappear. Did he ever mention Jake to you? Rachel's eyes narrowed. Yes, once. He said Jake laughed when he dropped Eli's books, that he stared at him like a bug. Said, he doesn't talk like a kid, he talks like something to break. Keene felt her stomach sink. She asked if Rachel wanted to see the notes. She nodded. When she read Eli's handwriting familiar loops, careful word-sure hands trembled. I used to help him write birthday cards, she said. That's him. That's his voice. The silence hung thick in the room. Then she asked a question Keene wasn't ready for. Can I see the place they found him? It wasn't protocol, but Keene said yes. That night, they walked the quiet halls of Red Pines. Past the classrooms, past the gym, past the lockers now sealed by yellow tape. Rachel stopped in front of number 128. The door had been removed. The space behind it now dark and hollow. She stood for a long time, then whispered, You left him here. All of you. Keene didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Some cases are about guilt. Others are about shame. This one was about silence. And now, that silence was broken. Red Pines High School had become a crime scene. Again. Not with flashing lights or sirens, but with the quiet churn of forensic specialists and structural engineers. A coffin had been hidden in plain sight, masked as a locker, ignored as part of the school's aging infrastructure. And the hallway, once echoing with the clatter of lockers and adolescent laughter, now hummed with generators, dust extractors, and whispered regrets. Detective Keene stood just outside the sealed West Wing, reviewing a newly completed forensic analysis. The bones recovered from the crawl space were consistent with a 15-year-old male. Multiple indicators suggested death by asphyxiation, likely due to oxygen deprivation in a sealed environment. No evidence of blunt force trauma, no weapon. Just slow suffocation in a space no wider than a bathtub. There were scratch marks on the inside of the wall panel. 7 of them. Long, desperate. One for each day, perhaps. Keene found herself picturing him in there. Alone. In the dark. No light. No food. No one answering his voice. A child, barely old enough to drive, locked away because someone else had decided he didn't matter. And worst of all, he'd been within screaming distance of help. Back at her desk, she combed through emails from tip lines. Dozens had poured in since the press conference. Most were noise, but one stood out. A name. Alex Brightman. A former student, now living in Portland. The email was short. I know things about Eli. About Jake. I've stayed quiet for too long. If you're serious about justice, I'll talk. I won't do it over the phone. Keene booked a flight that night. Alex lived in a sparse apartment above a bookstore. He was 31, Thin, nervous, eyes darting as he spoke, but he was clear. "I used to think I imagined it," he said, "but I didn't." "Imagined what?" Keene asked. "That last week. The week Eli disappeared. There was something going on. Something dark. I saw Jake drag him down the locker hallway 2 days before it happened, like physically pull him by the backpack. Eli didn't scream. He just froze. Like it had happened before." "Did you tell anyone?" Alex shook his head. "I was scared. Jake was untouchable. Star quarterback. He had teachers wrapped around his finger. He once broke a kid's glasses in gym and the coach told the other guy to apologize for getting in the way." Keene took notes. "Did you ever see inside locker 128? Number, but I heard rumors that someone had access to the crawl space behind there, a hideout, a place where kids got taught lessons if they talked too much." Keene's blood ran cold. "Who else knew?" Alex stared at her. "No one talked. You didn't want to be the next target." On the flight home, Keene reviewed every incident involving Jake Weller. There were minor infractions fights brushed off, hallway scuffles explained away. He'd been suspended once for disciplinary reasons, but the file was sealed. That needed opening. With a court order, she retrieved it. Inside was a report from a teacher who'd quit 2 months after Eli vanished. Her words, "Jake Weller is not just a bully. He's manipulative. He coerces others into silence. I found him threatening a student behind the gym. When I confronted him, he said, 'People like me don't get in trouble here. People like you just leave.'" The administration had labeled it a misunderstanding. The teacher resigned. Jake graduated. The case was buried. Until now. Keene had enough for a formal arrest warrant. But she hesitated. There was still one person she hadn't spoken to. Eli's mother. The house hadn't changed much. The paint had faded, and the porch creaked, but the wind chime still hung in the same spot Eli had once painted blue. Carla Turner opened the door, her face lined not just with time, but with the erosion of unanswered questions. "I heard," she said simply. "They told me it was him." Keene nodded. "I wanted to tell you in person." Carla invited her in. Photos lined the mantel. Eli at 6 with a telescope, Eli at 10 wearing a paper crown, Eli's last school portrait framed in soft gray. The smile in that photo now looked haunting. "I always knew he didn't run," Carla whispered. "He wasn't that kind of boy. He was scared of things, sure, but not a runaway. He wanted to be seen. He wanted someone to see him." Keene placed the plastic-sealed note on the table, the one that read, "If you find this, I didn't run. Please don't forget me." Carla read it, then held it to her chest. "I read to him every night until he was 12, she said, voice breaking. "When I stopped, he started writing his own stories. He left little notes in my shoes. This is his goodbye, and I never got to say mine." Keene told her about Jake, about the crawl space, about what the team believed had happened. Tears streamed down Carla's face. Not rage, not vengeance, just heartbreak. "I don't want him to suffer," she said quietly. "I just want someone to say what happened out loud, in the light, so he's not forgotten again." His note. That night, Keene sat in her car for a long time, staring at the photo of locker 128 on her dashboard. She thought of the sound the panel must have made when it locked, the way the world kept moving outside while a child died inside. She picked up her phone. "Bring him in," she said. 2 hours later, Jake Weller sat cuffed in an interrogation room. Keene entered, dropped the backpack on the table, Eli's NASA patches now clearly visible, and laid the note beside it. Jake didn't look at them. "You know what this is," Keene said. He said nothing. "We have the crawl space. We have witnesses. We have the janitor's log. And we have his words." Jake finally looked up. "He was supposed to scare easy," he muttered. Keene leaned forward. "He was a kid." Jake's face tightened. "He told someone. He was going to get me kicked off the team. I didn't mean for it to go that far." "You locked him in a box." Jake slammed his fists on the table. "I went back. Okay, I went back the next morning, but it was sealed already. I panicked. You left him. Jake's lawyer placed a hand on his shoulder, but it was too late. It was on record. Jake Weller was formally charged with manslaughter, unlawful imprisonment, and tampering with evidence. His trial would take months, but the weight of justice had finally started to move. At Red Pines, the locker wing was permanently closed. A plaque was mounted where number 128 had once stood, in memory of Eli Turner, 1992, 2007. You are seen. You are heard. You are not forgotten. On the first day of the new school year, students passed by it in silence. Some touched the metal, some cried. And some, who had only heard his name whispered in hallways, now said it out loud. Eli Turner. Not a runaway, not a ghost. A boy who deserved better. And finally, after 13 years, his story had come home. The courtroom was packed, but silent. Journalists lined the back rows. Former teachers, now grayer and quieter, sat in clusters. Some of Eli's classmates, grown now, with lives of their own, filled the benches like ghosts returning to a scene they'd left behind. Rachel Turner sat in the front row, her hands clenched, eyes fixed on the man seated at the defense table, Jake Weller. 13 years of silence had become a single name, and now the town was saying it aloud. Jake looked smaller than he had in the interrogation room. In a suit 2 shades too dark, he fidgeted with a pen cap and avoided eye contact. His lawyer had warned him not to speak to the press, not to look at the Turner family, not to react when the evidence was shown. But nothing could prepare him for the voice of the courtroom when the prosecution called its key witness. Rachel stepped forward. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply unfolded Eli's note, the one, recovered from the crawl space, and read it aloud. If you find this, I didn't run. Please don't forget me. She held the paper to her chest, just as her mother once had. My brother loved the stars, she said. He believed there were places where no one could hurt you. He wanted to be an astronomer because space was quiet, because in the sky no one shouted, no one locked you away. The courtroom listened as if the walls themselves were absorbing her words. He wasn't lost, she continued. He was buried. He was buried inside a school, and no one looked hard enough. No one cared loud enough. Except now, finally, someone is listening. Jake shifted in his chair. The weight of the truth was no longer avoidable. The prosecution followed with the janitor logs, the sealed teacher's file, the witness testimonies from Alex Brightman and Ben Morris. Piece by piece, the image of Jake Weller, golden boy and hometown hero, began to crack. The defense leaned hard into the argument of a tragic accident. They claimed Jake had no intention to kill, that it was meant to be a prank. That fear and youthful arrogance drove him to walk away. They cited his years of public service, his clean adult record. But Keene knew better. And so did the jury. Because intent fades when the evidence screams neglect. When a child scratches the walls and no one opens the door, it's not just an accident, it's abandonment. The trial lasted 8 days. On the 9th, the verdict was read. Jake Weller was found guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison for each year Eli Turner had been missing. Outside the courthouse, Carla Turner spoke briefly. My son was quiet, she said, but his silence has spoken louder than anything in this town's history. Let this never happen again. To any child, anywhere. The words rippled across Missouri, across the Midwest, and soon across the country. News outlets picked up the story. It trended on social media, numbered Justice for Eli. Podcasts dissected the case. True crime forums analyzed the clues that were missed. But inside Red Pines, a different kind of reckoning was unfolding. The school board met in emergency session. Questions poured in. How could a child vanish inside the walls of a school? Why was no thorough search conducted in 2007? How did a student with violent patterns go unchecked? An independent audit found that, while no laws were broken, countless red flags were ignored. The principal at the time had since retired, but issued a written statement. I failed Eli Turner, we all did. Keene, meanwhile, stayed quiet. She didn't seek the cameras, She turned down interviews. Her focus was on Rachland, on what would come next. Because while cases closed in files, grief didn't. Rachel had an idea. Not for revenge, but for restoration. She met with the school board, then with the mayor, then with survivors' foundations and education trusts. Within 6 months, a grant was established. The Eli Turner Scholarship for Overlooked Voices, awarded annually to students in small towns who feel unheard, those who might otherwise slip through cracks no one is watching. The dedication ceremony was held on a rainy Thursday. Students gathered beneath tents in the school courtyard. The podium was flanked by banners, stars, constellations, Eli's senior photo digitally rendered as if he had grown up. Rachel took the mic. "This isn't just about Eli," she said. "This is about every hallway, every classroom, every whisper that goes unchallenged. We failed him. So now we listen better, we speak louder, and we never ignore silence again." After the speech, they released paper lanterns into the skyone for every year Eli had been gone. As they rose, drifting beyond the clouds, the students stood in silence. Some cried, some just watched, but they all stayed until the last light vanished. Keene watched from the back, hands in her coat pocket. She didn't need thanks, just closure. Later that night, she returned to the station. Eli's file sat on her desk, a yellow tab labeled "Closed." But she opened it one last time. She read his note again. "If you find this, I didn't run. Please don't forget me." Then she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She cried. For the boy who hadn't run, for the town that hadn't looked, and for the woman who had finally listened. Outside, the stars began to appear on by one-like signals from a boy who had once believed in the sky. And this time, someone was watching. Cameron, Missouri wasn't the kind of town that made national headlines. It was the kind that lived quietly, church bells on Sunday, football lights on Friday, and little else in between. But now, it had become a cautionary tale. A symbol not of what was done, but of what wasn't. After the verdict, the town changed, but not all at once. It started small. The hallways at Red Pines High were quieter. Teachers now paused a moment longer when a student looked lost. Attendance records were double-checked. The maintenance wing, once ignored for years, was fully renovated, with lights installed above every locker bay and cameras placed strategically across previously unmonitored corridors. But even more than the infrastructure, something deeper had shifted. A kind of unease, a guilt that hummed beneath the surface. Because in a place where everyone once thought Eli Turner had simply run away, they now had to admit he had died within the walls they walked past every day. The PTA meetings, once focused on bake sales and parking issues, turned into forums for grief, for questions, for regret. One mother, her voice trembling, stood up and said, "My son told me in 2007 that a boy named Jake bullied kids near the gym. I told him to stay out of it, that it wasn't his business. And now I wake up every morning wondering if I helped silence Eli." Another father admitted he once confiscated a note in his daughter's locker about weird noises behind the walls. "I laughed it off," he said it was just pipes. I threw the note away." No one in Cameron was innocent anymore. Not really. At the local library, they organized a community read-aloud of Eli's favorite book, The Little Prince, a tribute to the boy who looked at stars and dreamed of escape. Dozens showed up, not just to read, but to listen, to feel close to a voice they had forgotten to hear. Rachel Turner sat in the back, her head bowed, tears on her cheeks. It was the first time in 13 years she had seen her brother's name treated not as a footnote, but as a chapter. Detective Keene, though publicly silent, watched from afar. And she wasn't the only one haunted by the aftermath. One afternoon she received a letter unsigned, no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Eli standing near the school entrance, smiling awkwardly, a backpack slung too heavily over one shoulder. On the back, someone had written, "He told the truth. We didn't listen." There were no fingerprints, no leads. But the letter wasn't meant to solve anything. It was a confession, a reckoning. And it wouldn't be the last. Weeks later, Keene received another message, this time a voicemail from a man who refused to give his name. I saw Jake go into that hallway more than once, after hours. Back then, I thought maybe he was meeting a girl, or sneaking off. I didn't want to get involved, but now I think about that locker every night. These voices didn't bring justice, but they chipped away at the wall of denial. Keene began compiling every message, every letter, every whispered account that came after the trial. Not to build another case, but to build a timeline of silence, a documentary of missed chances. She labeled the folder the Ecos file. Each account was raw. Some were heartbreaking, some were cowardly, but together they painted a picture clearer than any evidence. Eli had not been invisible. He had been seen, just not believed, not prioritized, not saved. Meanwhile, in Jefferson City, legislation began to stir. Rachel Turner, now acting as both an advocate and symbol, was invited to speak before a special education subcommittee. She didn't come with vengeance. She came with a list. More training for school staff in crisis detection. Mandatory physical searches in cases of student disappearance. Legal consequences for failure to report credible danger signs. An annual review of custodial reports in all public schools. She ended her speech with Eli's words, "If you find this, I didn't run." And she added her own, "You cannot run from responsibility. You can only walk toward it slowly, honestly, painfully." The committee voted unanimously to draft what would become known as the Turner Protocolsa, state-level initiative to prevent future oversights in student disappearances. It wasn't sweeping reform, but it was a start. Back in Cameron, the echoes kept coming. One day, in a downtown coffee shop, a woman tapped Keene's shoulder. "You don't know me," she said, "but I taught creative writing at Red Pines in 2006. Eli was in my class. He wrote a story once about an invisible planet where kids could scream as loud as they wanted, and no one ever told them to be quiet." She paused. "I still have it. Would you like it?" Keene nodded. Later, in her car, she read the short story. It was childish, full of spelling errors, but the metaphor was unmistakable. A boy hiding in a place where adults couldn't hear. A world where silence wasn't punishment, it was protection. The title was scrawled across the top in crooked block letters, "The Planet Where I'm Safe." Keene stared at it for a long time. That night, she visited Eli's grave. She hadn't been back since the burial. The headstone was simple. Eli Jonathan Turner, 1992, 2007. You are not forgotten. She placed the story beneath a small, smooth rock. Then she whispered, "They hear you now." But not everyone did. Behind the scenes, Jake Weller had begun an appeal. His lawyer argued that the sentence was excessive, that the media coverage had poisoned the jury pool, that the judge had erred in allowing Rachel's testimony. The appeal moved slowly, but it moved. Keene learned of it through a colleague. She wasn't surprised, but she was furious. She contacted Rachel. "He's trying to rewrite the story," Keene said. Rachel didn't hesitate. "Then we write it louder." And so began the next phase-not of a legal case, but of a legacy. Rachel and Keene co-founded a nonprofit, Eli's Light. Its mission, to protect overlooked children, to investigate cases dismissed too quickly, to push for policies that required schools to listen harder, search deeper, and act faster. The first project was local, a scholarship for students interested in social work, criminal justice, or advocacy. But within months, it expanded. A hotline, a podcast, even a mobile app for anonymous student reporting. Each initiative carried Eli's name. Each one ensured he would never be invisible again. By winter, the first snowfall had dusted Cameron white. On the anniversary of Eli's disappearance, Rachel returned to Red Pines, this time not for justice but for remembrance. She stood at the foot of the plaque. Other students joined, some teachers, even the new principal, who had been only a freshman when Eli vanished. They lit candles. One by one, they spoke his name. And that night, Under the Missouri stars, the boy who once wrote about other planets finally found a home on this one. Not behind a wall, not beneath a locker, but in voices that now refuse to stay silent. It was late January when the first copy of The Planet Where I'm Safe was published. Rachel Turner had partnered with a small independent press out of St. Louis to preserve her brother's story not just the way he died, but the way he lived. The book, bound in soft matte blue with white stars scattered across the cover, contained Eli's original short story, a foreword by Rachel, and a collection of essays, letters, and journal entries from those who had known him. Classmates, teachers, even the janitor, Mr. Levine. Each one was a piece of the puzzle that for 13 years had gone ignored. And now, at last, the world was listening. The book quickly caught attention. What began as a regional project was picked up by national bookstores, then featured in a New York Times Sunday review. The headline read, "The Boy in the Locker, a Town's Silence and One Sister's Fight for the Truth." Rachel was invited to speak on daytime news, on late-night interviews. She traveled to colleges, education conferences, and eventually Capitol Hill. Not as a celebrity, but as a witness, a sister. A survivor of silence, she carried Eli's note in her wallet. She never once let go of that line, "Please don't forget me." Meanwhile, Jake Weller sat in Missouri State Penitentiary. His appeal had been formally denied, but he hadn't stopped writing. From behind bars, he began sending longhand letters to his former teammates, to teachers, to local newspapers. Some were ignored. Some were returned unopened. Others were leaked online. They revealed a man unraveling. Jake wrote of guilt. Yes, but also of confusion, resentment, deflection. "I was 17, he wrote in one letter. "You act like I was a monster, but no one ever told me I couldn't push boundaries. I got away with everything. That's not just on me, that's on all of you." Everyone cheered when I made the winning pass. No one asked what happened to the quiet kid I used to shove. Okay. To some, it sounded like blame shifting. To others, it sounded like the cracks of realization. And it sparked a conversation far wider than Cameron. What do we do with boys like Jake? The ones who succeed, who charm, who intimidate, but who are protected not because they're good, but because they perform? The national discourse began shifting. Documentaries were proposed. Podcasts launched limited series on the case. True crime forums reanalyzed every piece of evidence. But amid the noise, the town of Cameron tried to move forward quietly. Detective Keene still worked her cases, but something inside her had shifted. The Turner investigation hadn't just been about a missing boy. It had been about visibility, about responsibility, about the small failures that add up to tragedy. She was changed. She drove slower now through school zones. She lingered longer when talking to teenagers. She paid attention in ways she hadn't before. Then came the day that changed everything again. A construction crew renovating the old Red Pines gymnasium found something in the foundation. At first it looked like scrap metal. Then they realized it was a crushed tin box. Inside, a cassette tape dated April 2007. On the label in shaky blue marker, "For if I don't make it, the workers called the police." The evidence was rushed to Keene. The tape was degraded, but forensic techs were able to restore most of the audio. And what they heard chilled the room to silence. "Hi. I don't know if anyone will find this. I'm Eli. I'm in a small space, I think, behind the school lockers. I heard them arguing. Jake was mad. He said I had to shut up or else. But I told Mr. Langley, I think Jake found out, and now I'm here. I'm not scared. I just want my mom to know I didn't do anything wrong. If I don't get out, just tell Rachel I love the stars. Tell her. I kept looking for them, even when it was dark." Arting. Keene felt the hair on her neck rise. Eli had tried. Even with nothing left, he'd tried to leave something behind. They released the audio with the Turner family's permission. It played on national radio. It ran on television. Millions heard the voice of a 15-year-old boy speaking calmly from the darkness, telling the world what had happened to him. The effect was seismic. Schools across the country held moments of silence. Vigils were held from Oregon to Maine. Candlelight ceremonies lit up school courtyards. Teachers played the tape during ethics lessons. Students wrote responses thousands of letters to a boy they never knew. Rachel read as many as she could. Some said, "You were brave." Others said, "I've felt invisible too." And one, sent anonymously, read, "Your story saved my life. I told someone." And they listened. That fall, Eli's law was passed in the state legislature. It mandated that any student reported missing for more than 4 hours on school grounds must trigger a full building search, including all maintenance zones and sealed areas. Custodial staff were now required to maintain access logs for all non-public spaces. The law wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Rachel stood beside the governor when the bill was signed. She didn't smile for the cameras. She just held up a small photograph of Elias' backpack crooked, his smile uncertain, and said, "Let's build a world where no more children have to leave notes in the dark." Keene retired the next spring. Her final act as detective was to file the Turner case folder in a drawer marked "Resolved, but never closed." She understood that cases didn't end with convictions. Not really. They ended when the echoes finally faded. And in Eli's case, they still hadn't. Before turning in her badge, she wrote a letter to Rachel. "I want you to know you did what law enforcement couldn't. You didn't solve a case. You broke a silence. And sometimes that's harder." Rachel framed it and hung it above her desk at Eli's Light headquarters. The organization had grown, now staffed by volunteers, caseworkers, and advocates across the Midwest. They had helped reopen 4 other cold cases. They had filed reports on educational negligence. And they had launched a new podcast, Locker 128. Each episode began the same way. "This is for the ones who were quiet, who were forgotten, who were told they were imagining things. You were right, and we hear you." One day, Rachel visited Locker 128 again. It had been sealed off, turned into a memorial, surrounded by letters and drawings. But someone had left a small plaque beneath the number. Here stood a boy who never stopped believing someone would open the door. She stood in silence. The wind blew through the empty hall. Somewhere outside, children were laughing. Eli's voice no longer echoed in loneliness. Now it echoed in action. And the town that once buried a truth beneath its floors had become a place that listened. Truly listened. For the first time. It was a soft spring morning in Cameron, Missouri. The kind where the sunlight comes filtered through the blooming dogwood trees and everything feels just a little lighter. At Red Pines High School, the bell rang at 8:05 sharp, just like it always had. But this day was not like the others. Today was the 4th of April, the anniversary of the day Eli Turner disappeared. In the years since his story broke through the stillness of the Midwest and echoed across the country, this date had become more than a wound. It had become a reminder, a vow, a moment of silence kept loud. The school gymnasiums, the site of neglect and decay, had been renovated and renamed. Its new name hung above the polished entry doors in brass letters. The Eli Turner Center for Student Safety and Well-Being. Inside, where weight racks and old bleachers used to stand, there were now counseling offices, a student-run help desk, and a permanent exhibit that told Eli's story in quiet, careful detail. Not the horror of his final days, but the beauty of who he had been, his sketches, his favorite astronomy notes. Even that wrinkled list of planets I'd like to visit someday. In the center of the room stood Locker 128, preserved, untouched. Its door open, never again closed. Each year, on the 4th of April, students came forward, some to speak, others just to listen. Today was no different. The lights were dimmed. Candles flickered along the baseboards. In the back row, Rachel sat beside Keene. The former detective no longer wore her badge, but she carried with her the full weight of what it meant. Principal Hartley took the microphone. He hadn't known Eli. He was barely out of college in 2007, but he'd read every file, watched every interview. And now, he led this school with a different set of eyes. "We're not here to reopen wounds," he said. "We're here to keep the door open, for those who come after, for the ones who don't speak loudly, for the ones who've been taught that silence is safer." He turned to Rachel. Would you like to say something? She stood, slowly. She no longer trembled when facing a crowd. Her voice, once hoarse with grief, now rang steady. I used to think Eli died because no one saw him, she began. But that's not true. People saw him. They just looked away, they turned their heads, or told themselves someone else would step in. She glanced around the room. That's how silence works. It doesn't scream. It whispers. It convinces you that you're not the one responsible. A pause. And then it buries children in walls. The room was quiet. A few students wiped away tears. Others stared into their laps. Rachel continued. We can't go back. We can't pull Eli from the darkness. But we can make sure no other student has to write a note to the future, hoping someone will care enough to read it. She held up a laminated copy of Eli's final letter. It lived here no one display behind museum glass, but she kept a copy with her everywhere. She read it again, as she had every year. If you find this, I didn't run. Please don't forget me. And then she looked up. You are not forgotten. That night, a storm rolled across the edge of town. Not violent, but steady. Rain tapped on windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Keene sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting shadows across the floor. She opened the old Echoes file. It was nearly full now. Testimonies, letters, recorded confessions, second-hand accounts, a collective journal of what had been missed. She wasn't looking to reopen anything. She just wanted to understand how it had all happened. Again, and again, and again. Because for every Eli, there were more. Some who ran, some who didn't, some who were never found. She turned the last page. And there, tucked between two folded statements, was a new envelope. No return address. Just the number 129 scribbled in the corner. The locker, next to Eli's. Hare's stomach tightened. Inside the envelope, one photograph. A boy. Slouched posture. Hood pulled up. One sneaker untied. The timestamp in the corner read March 2024. Just weeks ago. No note. Just the picture. She looked closer. The background clearly a school hallway. Red Pines or somewhere else. She flipped the photo over. One word, hastily written. Look. That was all. Keene stared for a long time. It could have been a prank. But she'd learned never to ignore the subtle signals again. She placed the photo in a new file labeled simply, Ongoing, and then she turned off the lamp. Across town, Rachel sat in her office at Eli's Light, reading emails from young volunteers. Stories were pouring in now, not about crimes, but about intervention. One student said a teacher had noticed a change in her walk and asked questions. Another said they found courage to speak up after hearing the podcast. It was working. Slowly. Quietly. But it was working. She clicked open a message from a boy in Kansas. I used to think being invisible was easier. But then I heard Eli's story. And I realized, maybe someone will see me too. She typed back, They do, I promise. Later that night, she stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The clouds parted just enough to reveal a handful of stars above Cameron. She smiled. Then she whispered into the dark. Still watching? Epilogue. Some stories end with justice, others with heartbreak. But Eli Turner's story ends with something rarer. A door that didn't shut, a silence that didn't win, and a voice quiet, steady, and shining still echoing through every hallway that dares to forget. Because now, someone always opens the door, and someone always listens.